Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 20. Guys, we are 20 episodes in. How crazy is that? In this week's episode, we're talking all about how to use the survival skills that so many of us developed throughout our childhoods as positives in our lives moving forward. And before we get into this week's episode, I just want to take a quick minute to thank everyone who's been tuning in and following along. If you've been enjoying these episodes, please be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel on YouTube, and if you're listening on Spotify, to leave us a rating. That being said, let's dive into this week's topic. A lot of the behaviors that so many of us develop throughout our childhoods are actually survival techniques. They're ways of us interpreting behavior, right? And then best sort of catering our words, our actions to suit that behavior so that we get the most positive reaction. I've thought a lot about children experiencing and enduring emotional abuse and trauma. I've reflected a lot on my own experience. And for whatever reason, when I think about this, I think about it in a very primitive way. I imagine a baby animal. And, when they first come into the world, they're incredibly vulnerable. They're impressionable. And the way that they learn a lot of the really basic life skills that they need to survive those first few crucial weeks or months or years, they do so through observing the behavior of their parents or other adults around them. And I think that that is very true for human babies too. We don't necessarily have the emotional skills or foresight to understand the behavior that we're receiving from our parents or other adults or even a sibling. All we know, I think, in those moments is what feels good and what doesn't. And I think what's so remarkable about children who were raised by narcissistic parents is that we develop skills. Really, when you think about it, they are survival skills that are far beyond our capabilities at such a young age. And, we learn to pick up on very minor changes in mood or tone or energy and to adjust our behavior to then receive the best possible outcome from our parent. And we do all of this without connecting those dots. As adults, I think a lot of us develop that awareness of our own behavior where we can say, okay, I understand what I'm experiencing now. I know why I feel this way, and I can adjust my behavior to make this situation a little bit more positive overall. But as kids, we don't really have that yet. We haven't developed that emotional intelligence or maturity yet. And so we're just picking up on these things and sort of instinctually integrating them into our lives. And, when I think about it, it makes me feel like all of us were just little superheroes growing up. And that kind of drives this week's topic. I wanted to talk about how so many of these survival skills that we developed throughout our childhood, now as adults, we can sort of morph and mold them into something really positive that can actually serve us in a really great way moving forward. And the first one that comes to mind is something that I struggle with quite a bit, and something that I know a lot of you struggle with also, and that is hypervigilance. And for just a little bit of a recap, if this is the first episode that you're listening to, hypervigilance basically refers to always being aware of everything that's going on around you all the time and feeling responsible for it. So imagine being raised in a toxic environment with a very emotionally reactive, volatile parent. You develop this ability to pick up on really small changes in tone, mood, behavior, energy of your parent, because when you do that and the better you get at it, the better your position within the family is as a whole. And I think it's a skill that you develop relatively early, and it's something that you continually integrate into your life pretty seamlessly. So let's say you're dealing with a narcissistic parent and maybe even another sibling, and that sibling says or does something that triggers your narcissistic parent. Immediately, you will be aware that whatever your sibling said or did maybe had the possibility of being perceived in a negative way by your parent based on past history, right, of interactions, experiences, encounters similar to this. And you will immediately pick up on the really small changes in tone and mood and behavior of your parent in that moment. And then you start to feel responsible for regulating your parent's emotions. You're already thinking of ways to diffuse the situation and move on so that this doesn't get any bigger than it needs to be. You sort of automatically take on that role. And what's really interesting about these different topics that I'm going to touch on throughout this episode is that they're positive things at the root, but because of that word hyper that's thrown in there, they are so intensified. Where having an awareness of other people is a positive thing, of how they're feeling, of how what you say and do affects them, right? That's not a negative. But when vigilance becomes hypervigilance, you lose the ability to focus on yourself. And instead, you feel solely responsible for the emotions and feelings of other people. And so you're really abandoning yourself and taking on these really difficult situations and emotions that at the end of the day are not your own, which means you cannot control them. And that, I think, is when it gets really out of hand. And so hypervigilance is sort of like being trained to run a marathon, right? And what we have to do now is just learn how to run a mile. Right? Every time we go to the gym, we're not going for the 26.2, we're going for 1, right? And when we can learn to do that, I think that is when these skills can really start to serve us in a positive way. And so when I think about hypervigilance in my own life and how I've tried to tone that down to just vigilance, right? I think about awareness and being insightful, understanding how things that I say and do affect other people, right? There's a lot of positives in there. And the way that I've been able to kind of manage this hypervigilance, to tone it down just a little bit, is to not always act on my impulses. I remind myself that I'm not responsible for regulating the emotions of other people, right? But it is a positive thing for me to understand how something that I say or do affects the other person involved, whether it's a relationship, in a social setting, a family setting, whatever it might be. Having a certain level of awareness of other people, being able to read a room and understand, okay, does this make someone comfortable? Are they uncomfortable? Did something I say have a positive or a negative effect on them? And not only is it the ability to be aware of other people's emotions and how they're feeling and what affects them, but there's also a level of insight, I think, that comes into play with hypervigilance, which can be really beneficial, especially if you're talking about close family relationships, friendly relationships, romantic partners, right? You're paying attention a lot of the time. And this is one of the aspects of my life that I'm not sure I can tie directly back to something like hypervigilance or trauma, but it's a really positive. It's always been a real source of happiness for me, and that is gift giving. I love being the person in a relationship who listens to these really small passing comments or moments, these details that the person I'm talking to, I'm sure, imagines I would never even remember, right? But then their birthday rolls around, or Christmas, or maybe I just go out of my way to do this thing for them, right? And I surprise them with this gift or this gesture that they never would have imagined otherwise, but I remembered it because I logged it in the back of my brain because I'm really paying attention to everything that you're saying and how you're saying it. And when you think about it in that way, it's such a positive thing because that feeling, being able to, I guess, create feelings of joy and happiness for other people, it's so wonderful. And I think what that does is something that so many of us lacked throughout our childhood. It makes people feel seen and heard and understood. And I think being on the receiving end of toxicity at the hands of a narcissistic parent, to then being able to kind of provide those really positive emotions, to be the source of that for other people, is such a really impressive and fulfilling transition to make, in my opinion. And another one that I think can be really positive as long as we understand how to tone it down, and that is perfectionism. Right? Perfectionism is something that I struggle with on pretty much a daily basis. It's a constant struggle of reminding myself that not everything has to be exactly the way that I think it should be, and that my idea of what perfection is unique to me. that doesn't necessarily translate to everyone else. Everyone sort of has a unique idea of what that means. Everyone's standards are different. What they feel comfortable with is different. But again, similar with hypervigilance, where it's like we have these skills. We have these really important, could be positive skills, but they're just a little too intense. And so perfectionism can be a really positive thing if we tone it down just a little bit and we sort of mold that into having a strong work ethic. I personally think that it's a good thing, it's constructive to be your own worst critic. I think in a lot of ways that pushes you to excel and to really sort of push the boundaries of what you're capable of, to challenge yourself, to try new things. And when we're able to channel that constructive, critical energy into something positive, I think that's when a lot of us shine. And that's when I think so many of us see what we're truly capable of. And, in thinking about a lot of these topics, I think the recurring theme for me is, there's probably a number of people who are not hypervigilant. Maybe they can't read a room very well. They don't have a very strong work ethic. And they kind of have to build up to those things. And the way that I view it with so many of us is that we've got these skills. These skills are just so intensified that we really have to tone them down, because I think that is when they become a negative. When we become so hyper fixated on these things that they really dominate and permeate every single aspect of our lives, it becomes counterproductive. And in a way, I think viewing it through this lens where it's like this skill is already there and we've got a lot of practice with it. All I have to do now is just kind of like not act on these impulses every single time, just tone it down a little bit. That for me makes it all feel a little bit more manageable. And so for perfectionism, one of the ways that this manifested itself in my life, in my opinion, is school. Looking back, I always did really well in school. On my progress report, I always got the, always participates, have your hand up. I was a very conscientious student. All of my teachers had positive things to say about me, and I always did really well academically in terms of my grades. But looking back, I was not the best in history. I was not the best in English. I didn't always read all of the books that I was assigned to read. I didn't fully understand all of the different literary techniques that the author used and, the analogies and the metaphors. I didn't. But I was a perfectionist. And I think the way that I was able to morph or mold that into something positive, even in that time in my life, was through having a really strong work ethic and pushing myself to my limits to see what I was capable of. And I think it's very similar in other aspects of life where you have a certain standard and you have an idea of what you want to do and what you're capable of, sort of pushing the boundary. And I think that can be a really positive thing, because that so often is when growth happens, is when we try something new, something that we've never done before. Or maybe we try something once and we know, okay, this is good, but it can be better. So I'm going to try it again because I have that self-belief. I have that belief in my abilities. I think where perfectionism starts to be a bit of a negative is when we do take it too far, when nothing we do is ever good enough. And I think typically there's like two paths that you can go down when you struggle with perfectionism. And that's either obsession, where whatever it is that you're focused on, you're going to become entirely obsessed with that thing until you have absolutely mastered it, and then you'll feel comfortable. Or it's just complete avoidance, where it's like, I have tried and nothing is living up to my standard, so I have to just completely cut this out of my life because even thinking about it is far too stressful. And I think going down either of those paths is really counterproductive, because what we're doing is preventing ourselves from progressing. I think another thing that's really important to remember about perfection is that it's completely subjective. What feels right to you might not feel right to anyone else. In fact, it might be the complete opposite. And so when we set out to do something, I think it's really important to remember that the outcome, the result, whatever it is that we're working on, it's going to be interpreted differently by everyone. And so it's important to not get too caught up in your own interpretation of that, in your own feelings. It's important to just try and to make the effort and to put things out there, even if you don't entirely feel like this is the best work that you've ever done. Because what I've learned throughout my life, whether it was building furniture, making videos, shooting a podcast, is that you can't wait until you're ready to start. And I think once you actually start and you start putting these ideas into practice, you're sort of gaining experience, real life experience. That is when you're able to reflect on your work and make improvements, little tweaks along the way. And as you go on doing that, I look back sometimes at the first table that I have ever made, the first piece of furniture, and I don't want to say that I'm appalled because I know that it's part of the process. But it's very clear, I'll put it this way, just how much I've learned and how far I've come. But if I never made that first table, I would have never made the most recent one, which is leaps and bounds better than where I started. So I think perfectionism becomes a real negative when it prevents us from starting. If we can channel that inner critic in a really positive way and actually make the steps to implement the things that we want to do, I think that skill, even though it's rooted in perfectionism, can become a real positive. And the root of this next thing is also pretty negative because it's rooted in trauma. It's rooted in manipulation. And this next survival skill that I want to talk about is being a good judge of character, being very insightful, very perceptive. We have been on the receiving end of a lot of negative behavior, and so we can spot it, probably a little bit easier than the average person. We know how it feels to be manipulated, and so we've sort of got this sixth sense where we can feel when something is off. And not only do we sort of have this additional sense, but I think it's common for a lot of children of narcissistic parents to have experienced a very intense level of manipulation, whether that's gaslighting or projection, triangulation, invasions of privacy, control. There's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot of toxicity that you endure in an environment like that. And so not only do we know how to spot it, and do we know what it feels like, but we're also aware that that could be an intention or a motive of someone sort of behind their actions. And so we're not maybe tricked as easily as the average person. And when you think about this at its core, right, it comes from a more negative place. And some of the memories that can be associated with this survival skill are probably a bit more painful, a bit more negative. But for me, in my life and throughout my healing journey, especially dealing with this perfectionism like we just touched on and sort of learning to be okay with my mistakes, one of the things that I have come to realize is no negative experience is entirely negative if you can learn something from it. And that is kind of the same method of thinking that I applied to this particular skill. Because when I think about the fact that at such a young age, I had to develop this insightfulness, right? The reason that I understand what gaslighting and manipulation and control look and feel like is because I've experienced it. And while that's a negative, right, now moving forward, I know that if I ever encounter that again, not only will I know, but I'll be prepared. I'll know how to respond. I won't sort of get sucked into a negative situation because I'm not naive to these things. And so it's been really important for me to assess the negative experiences in my life and to really try to search for a silver lining or some sort of positive. And that is the positive that I take from this is being really sort of aware, especially coupled with this hypervigilance, right? We've been on the receiving end of a lot of this toxicity. We know what it looks and feels like, and we're hyper aware of when we're experiencing these things. And it's kind of funny. It makes me think about growing up. One of my favorite shows of all time to this day is Survivor. And I remember thinking to myself always, I would be so great on this show because I would know when people are lying to me. I would know when they're trying to tell me sort of a half truth or they're manipulating me. And I have a really good sense of what's going on around me at all times. If these two people go off and talk, or maybe they're acting a little bit different, I'm going to be able to pick up on those things. And I know it might sound a little silly to apply this to a reality TV show, but it is a skill that I think a lot of us can employ in our real lives. And it's something that can serve us in a positive way. As long as we don't don't let it dominate our thoughts, right? Where we're not always thinking, oh, I'm being manipulated, or there's a possibility that there's a really negative motive behind this person's kind gesture, right? We're able to kind of pull in the reins a little bit. There's restraint that's involved in healing, I think, when it comes to a lot of these survival skills, because they are so intense. And so if we're able to manage these feelings and we're just aware that they're there and we can kind of call upon them when necessary, that is a really great thing. And the next survival skill that I want to talk about, again, has its roots in a more negative place, and that is narcissism. When we think about narcissism and what it is at its core, it's self-importance. It's sort of this grandiose idea that I'm the best, smartest, most attractive, talented person that there is. No one is better than me, and I can do no wrong, right? That, I think, is very true of the ideology of a lot of narcissists. And the positive, I think, that we can take from this is sort of morphing that self-importance into confidence. Growing up, parents are very strong role models. And chances are, for the first few years of your life, you're spending a significant amount of time with your parents, observing their behavior, mimicking their actions, listening to their words. And depending on the role that you fulfill within your family, you might even be called upon to implement those same narcissistic tendencies and behaviors. And so you've got a lot of practice with this sort of self-importance, this single-minded view of reality. And while that itself is a negative, I think one of the things that so many children of narcissistic parents lack is self-trust, is a sense of identity. And I think if we can sort of take that self-importance that is very true of narcissism and sort of mold that into confidence, that is when it can be a positive thing. That is when observing narcissistic tendencies throughout our life can become a positive, when we use that very thing to form that self-trust and that sense of identity, where now, even here I am, sitting here, I never thought that I would start a mental health podcast, right? I never thought that I would put these things out into the world and share my experience. But there's a part of me that feels like what I have to say is important, and that sharing my experience has value, and I believe in myself. I trust in my abilities and my ideas. I feel justified in the decisions that I make. And there is a particular element, I think, of growing up with a narcissistic parent where when you're younger, you may not interpret those kinds of behaviors as negative. That self-importance, feeling really justified in your opinions, this sort of big personality. I think when you're younger, you can interpret it in a bit more of an innocent way, where it's like, oh yeah, my mom or dad knows what they're talking about. You know, they feel like they're important and they're going to go out of their way to do these things and to put themselves maybe in these positions of power or control, these decision-making positions. And that can be a really scary position to put yourself in, whether you're a kid or an adult, whether it's in a professional or a personal setting. But I think sometimes observing that level of self-belief can be a positive once you recognize that you need perspective. Because I think that is something that narcissists lack, is perspective. They don't necessarily understand how their behaviors or their words impact the people around them. They don't feel like they need to be held accountable for their own words or actions. That, I think, is when it really starts to take a turn for the negative. But observing that self-belief, I think, and understanding that as long as you don't feel like I'm better than everyone else, and what I have to say is way more important than what anyone else has to say, and I can do no wrong. I can say or do whatever I want, and I feel completely justified in that no matter what anyone says, right? That is where the perspective comes into play. Turning that self-importance into confidence, I think, can serve so many of us in a really positive way moving forward. To understand that we inherently, as the people that we are, have value. We're important. And if we feel like we want to share our experiences, if we want to put ourselves out there, maybe for a new job or applying to a really great school, things that maybe we don't fully believe just yet, right? That confidence, I think can help us to take that step to sort of, one of my favorite sort of phrases, and this was something that I thought about a lot when my husband and I were starting our furniture business, was leap and a net will appear. And I think the idea behind that phrase is just, it's so powerful, because it kind of means that if you want to put yourself out there and do this thing, you can't wait. Again, it's that same idea. You can't wait until you're ready to start. You have to have faith that once you make this decision, right, you have enough belief in yourself that you're going to make it happen, that the stars are going to align, right, and a path will then be shown to you. And I think confidence is hugely important moving forward in healing and developing that sense of self and that identity and that self-trust. And so especially, these are only 4 things that I touched on, because these are 4 things that are very true in my life. These are things that I experience, that I struggle with and sometimes succeed at on, a daily basis. And so I felt I had some insight to offer here. But the survival skills that you develop being raised by a narcissistic parent do not stop here. And so when you think about the number of behaviors that you have witnessed and mimicked and adapted, all sort of combined together. I mean, imagine the power of hypervigilance and insight, right? Knowing when you're being manipulated and being able to pick up on really small changes in tone or mood, or that self-importance turned to confidence. Right now I've got confidence. I feel really justified in the decisions that I make. I believe in myself, and the things that I want to say or do are important. That, coupled with that hard work ethic that maybe stems from perfectionism, you can do great things. And one of the reasons that I was so excited to talk about all of this today is because I've been feeling lately like I'm at the point in my healing journey where I no longer am realizing my trauma as frequently as I was in the beginning. We're learning about things like gaslighting and projection and enmeshment for the first time, learning about narcissism for the first time. It was like light bulbs were going off in my head left and right multiple times a day. And I was just so engulfed in realizing my trauma and reflecting on my experience when I was younger. And now I feel like I'm at a point where I have a relatively good grip on my trauma and my childhood experience and the behavior that I endured, that I witnessed and mimicked at times. I've been able to let go of a lot of that and start to move forward. And where I'm at now feels a lot more like the future, if that makes sense, where, realizing my trauma, there was a lot from the past that was resurfacing. And not only am I trying to be really mindful and present in the moment now, but I'm also thinking about the future and moving forward. And that is such an exciting thing, because healing from trauma it dominates you. You think about it all the time. It's something that affects every aspect of your life, and it can be really overwhelming sometimes. But once you start to reach the point where you understand, these more negative behaviors, but you can find that silver lining. You can kind of turn it into a positive thing that's going to better help you to progress in creating the kind of life that you want now. Oh my gosh. I mean, it's so freeing, and it feels in a lot of ways to me like this is just the beginning of my life. I've experienced a lot. I've learned a lot up until this point, but I haven't ever been the person that I am today. I haven't had the knowledge or the perspective or the clarity, for that matter. And that is partially why I was so excited to talk about these topics today, to just really encourage you to look at the negative experiences in your life, even outside of your childhood or a traumatic relationship with a narcissistic parent. In any aspect of your life, reflect on the more obviously negative experiences and try to ask yourself, okay, what can I learn from this? What was the positive here? What am I not going to do again so that I make sure to not make that same mistake twice? And once you sort of develop that ability and you put it into practice, it's so reminiscent of healing. The more you practice these things, the easier they become to integrate into your life. And so even now, sometimes, I'll encounter a negative experience and I might be really sad about it in the moment, or frustrated or overwhelmed. But at the end of it, I'm able to sort of reflect and look back on it and say, okay, that's what I took from this. I'm not going to do that again, or I'm going to do this differently next time. And I think that's another skill that I think a lot of us can develop or have developed that can serve us in a really positive way moving forward. So I hope that this episode was helpful, and I hope it offered up some positivity and encouragement moving forward to kind of take this really awful negative thing in our life and use it to fuel the best times and experiences and feelings. That's my hope in this. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap up this week's episode, but I will be back very soon with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Ooh, and a very exciting announcement next week. Bye.